Hello.
Hello.
Thank you ever so much for being here. It's very exciting. I know we know each other, but I'm Bea Raffengower, current PhD student with the Institute of Criminology, and very honoured to be here today. I don't know if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Lorraine Gelsthorpe. I've been at the Institute for a very long time.
Yes.
First of all as a student, then as a departmental lecturer, university lecturer, and more recently, for the last 5 years, as director of the Institute, which has been a very great privilege.
Excellent. We have thoroughly enjoyed you, I have to say, as students. I know from those that I have contact with, having you as director, we've really appreciated it. And so the purpose of talking today is to discuss your most recent book, but also discuss your contributions to criminology more generally. And as you said, you're at the end of a 5-year term at the director of the Institute of Criminology, but were also awarded the 2021 European Society of Criminology Prize for lifetime achievement and contributions in regard to criminology, which is amazing. And so we would like to take this moment to discuss all of the above as much as you would like to, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So perhaps we will start with the new book that we have here.
Okay, yes.
If you would like to give us an overview, if you may.
Sure. I mean, I can't quite say that the book is a lifetime achievement.
Sure.
but it reflects very long-standing interest in women crime and criminal justice. And the book itself was a long time in the making, perhaps 3 years or more. And we became more critical in our approach as we developed the book. Shelley Brown, my co-editor of the book, is a psychologist, and because I'm a criminologist, with all that means in terms of a multidisciplinary approach, we had some very interesting discussions along the way. It's a handbook, a Wiley handbook on what works with girls and women in conflict with the law, a critical review of theory, practice and policy. It's not a handbook in the sense of it being a toolkit. Rather, it's a collection of, we like to think, cutting edge essays, which kind of reflect the current state of knowledge, pointing out gaps as well as what we do know, and some of the nuances in relation. It's a book about imperatives, ideas and initiatives. I mean, imperatives, I think, include the need to recognise that women and girls are a distinct group of people who are mired in the criminal justice system, sometimes recognising distinctions between those broad groups of women and girls, of course, thinking about younger women, black women, minoritised women, so on and so forth. And the ideas and initiatives part of the book refer to the extant, the current, what works, evidence germane to girls and women in conflict with the law, or at least the nascent nature of the evidence base. So in some respects the book details what might work, what the possibilities are, and what we should be pursuing much more than hitherto.
Which is still so needed, even in 2022. I find myself saying that quite often, saying even in 2022 we still need this. So excellent. Thank you very much for those of us who we now have it in a nice succinct book. You've done all the hard work for us. And so is there any of the topics in particular you would like to discuss in more detail here, or the range of topics covered?
Well, perhaps I can just say something about the structure of the book, and then perhaps focus on what I think, for me, are the highlights in terms of contributions. I mean, there are several parts to the book, and the first part focuses very much on theories of female offending, women in conflict with the law. I mean, we try to avoid the term female offenders because, of course, women are women first and foremost, and offending, may be part of a complex of problematic behaviour. So In the first part, we look at theories, pathways into crime, whether that's social control, life course perspectives, feminist perspectives, even looking at pathways into crime through a biosocial and evolutionary lens.
Yeah.
The second part of the book focuses much more on assessment and security classification, because there's been a long-standing concern about the way in which women's needs are transposed into risks. So women are very often high on needs, multiple problems, complex problems, so on and so forth, and those needs get translated into high risk, which is all very confusing. But the risk assessments themselves are not always gender neutral. One or two of the chapters actually look at the possibility of more gender neutral assessment tools that can be used, and look at advances in female offender risk assessment and so on. The third part of the book looks at the meaning of gender responsive tenants. What does it mean to be gender responsive throughout the system, not just in prisons, but in rehabilitation, gender informed justice more generally, looking at the impact of imprisonment and community-based sanctions on families, not just on women themselves, looking at gender responsive approaches to problem substance abuse, so on and so forth. The fourth part of the book offers a range of perspectives on gender responsive models in practice. And of course, this is an international compendium of perspectives, so it's rich in detail on different initiatives in different countries, including Scotland, including Canada, including a focus on England and Wales, in the USA and Australia and so on. And then the fifth part of the book then focuses on working with specific populations in the criminal justice system, and that's where we're able to look at Indigenous girls and women in Maori, New Zealand, Indigenous groups, Inuit and other groups in Canada, so on and so forth. It's a very important contribution there. And that section includes a focus on mental health, trauma and mental health, and the way in which those experiences can be pathways into crime, because of course trauma, mental health issues can lead to various psychological sequelae, consequences that lessen confidence, self-esteem, so on and so forth.
And increase vulnerability.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the chapters looks at offending during adolescence and emerging adulthood. One of the themes there is actually bereavement of grandparents, or key features in young women's lives can impact on their pathways into crime. And we also look at personality disorders and offending, the links there. Also, women perpetrators of sexual offences, not much talked about, and we shouldn't get we shouldn't exaggerate the numbers there, but nevertheless, there's a distinct group of women who do commit such offences. And then the final part of the book focuses on legal and policy implications. And I think there, perhaps this is partly an answer to your question about distinctive features as a book, because there I think that one of the distinctive contributions of the book is not just to say, well, what works in terms of programmes or approach in prison, so on and so forth, but it's to try and put things in context, international context, of course, but to say we need to look beyond programmes and we need to think about necessary legal changes. We need to look at sentencing. We need to look at. We need to take a holistic approach to the criminal justice system. We need to consider why community sanctions are not used more, why there's such a focus on imprisonment, so on and so forth. So I think those are distinctive contributions. Also, the critical approach that we take, recognising that there's no one answer, that different contexts will shape responses in the broader context of those different criminal justice systems, that we question, collectively, we question what is meant by risk assessment and the approaches and so on. I guess we're trying to move the debate on a bit from a simple analysis of, well, this programme seems to work and this programme doesn't.
And we'll just leave it at that sort of thing instead. Yes, explore it further. I mean, I always think it is incredible that, like I already said, it's 2022 and we're still saying these things. Would you mind perhaps giving us a little more information for those at home who haven't read about this recently or perhaps had different focuses in their work, as to why it is important to have a more gendered approach when it comes to things such as risk assessment? So I think certainly something I get asked about from those who may not have wider knowledge about it is, but it's just equal, right? And the response is, well, that's not as straightforward as that seems. Would you like to give us a little more information about why it is important to look at these things?
Well, it's a good question, and of course equality doesn't mean sameness.
Exactly.
It means responding to the different needs of groups. And if we think about what we know about women and crime, the pathways are rather different from the pathways into crime of men and boys. And one of the characteristics of women who end up in conflict with the law is to do with trauma and complex relationships. Many women have been subject to child sexual abuse. Many women have been subject to violence within the home, intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, so on and so forth.
And particularly so within the community that you're talking about here, those who do have extended conflict with the law at later stages, even more so, isn't it, for this population?
Yes. So I think there's every justification for treating women differently. But if we also look at what works, we do know that particular things work well with women. I say we don't know all the answers, but we do have emerging evidence on what we know works, what we're confident about, what works. So the fact that women commit less crime, less serious crime, mostly non-violent crime, so on and so forth, I think that alone, plus compounding factors about women who are imprisoned, there being deleterious effects on the family, on children, so on and so forth. I think all of those reasons compel us to think about what is needed to actually address concerns. We do, certainly in England and Wales, we imprison a high proportion of women for non-violent offences, which has a huge impact on the families of those women, many of whom are the heads of single-parent families, and so on. And I just think there is evidence to suggest that we could do things differently, more creatively, and importantly, more effectively.
Absolutely, I very strongly agree. I think I can't remember the exact statistics, but in brief, it was I mean, over 3/4 of women imprisoned are single-parent households, so what happens to their children is much more up in the air. They might be into foster care, it might be to a long-lost relative, it might, you know, etc. Whereas it's less than 1/4 of men going into prison in the same experience. And not to say that a father going into prison doesn't equally have a damaging effect, but if you're able to stay in your own life and the father moves away, that could be quite different to your entire environment changing, and how that can then perpetuate that cycle of trauma and experience and later offending.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting that a high proportion of the children of women who are imprisoned do end up in local authority.
Yeah.
Very fewer than 5% actually remain in their own home, whereas with men there seem to be more people around, more family members around who are willing to look after the children in their own home. Yeah.
And they're just, that shake up in and of itself, let alone the loss of a parent, is just, it's like such a complicated way of dealing with it all that perpetuates the damage that is done. I would imagine. Excellent. So is there, perhaps moving on from that, is there a reason why there's certain countries that you focus on in your book were chosen? Is it because of particularly good or different practices that they have, or it's because of research that you and Shelley already had ongoing?
I think it's that the book reflects what we knew about. We obviously investigated things. We don't have very much, if anything, from Asia.
Yes.
Countries. I mean, that would be another project.
Yes, true. Yes, that's it.
Although we became aware of some of the research findings in the course of doing research for this particular book.
So is that another book on the horizon?
Well,
perhaps?
May well be, but I think it would require key participants from those countries themselves. One couldn't presume to know or understand different cultural perspectives and so on.
But so we have America, New Zealand, Australia, England and Wales, Scotland, Canada, and that's all.
No, we have one or two others.
One or two others, yes, of course. But you have to get the book to find those out. Excellent. And so we talked about a more holistic approach. Is there anything you would like to add into that you think, I've realised this is a very broad question here, which says, so what does or does not work with women and girls? But that is probably too vague a question.
Well, I think it's a good question. And we people. I want to encourage people to read the book, of course, to find out what does and doesn't.
Because it isn't. You can't, like you've already said. It's not just a one thing. Now we can do this moving forward. It's, I think, to look at a range of responses and changes,
and a range of responses for particular groups of women. What works with young women won't necessarily work with older women or Indigenous women.
Absolutely,
and so on. Generally, though, if I was to very general, I would say that what we know from the evidence thus far is that a women-centred approach is important. Gender responsive, whether that's community penalties or prison regimes and so on. There needs to be a specific focus on what we know about women, their needs, their past experiences of trauma, past experiences of domestic abuse, so on and so forth. And there are all sorts of questions that we need to ask about, what support is available in prisons or in the community for women who've offended but who have been subject to domestic abuse, sexual violence, so on and so forth. And because some women have offended, does that put them at the bottom of the pile in terms of access to resources, or does the complexity of their lives, sometimes chaotic lifestyles and so on, does that make it very difficult for women to access such resources? I would want to say, very simply, and at a very general level, women-centred approaches, in prison or community programmes, as I say, offering mixed provision, not just focusing on the offending behaviour or offences that women have committed, but bearing in mind that women who offend are first and foremost women.
Yes.
And so looking at needs alongside women who perhaps not offended in women's resources centres, so on and so forth, where women who've offended can benefit from what Judith Rumgay once called normal Smiths, ordinary women facing ordinary challenges of everyday life. There's a lot to be learned. Empowerment, approaches which empower women and which don't dictate to women what they need to do, but take a joint approach really to discover what's going to be useful for women themselves, so actually learning from women's experiences and women themselves, women's voices, very important in all of this. Also, utilising effective learning styles. We know from various educationalists that men and boys often learn in a more competitive setting. It kind of drives people to learn, whereas girls and women are much more collaborative in the approach. So shared problem solving, hence the idea of normal Smiths and women who've offended learning alongside other women who perhaps have different kinds of challenges, but who nevertheless have some challenges. A holistic stance, not just focusing on the offending behaviour. That may be just one element in people's lives. I would say also that it's important to facilitate contact with mainstream agencies. Now, whichever country, context or culture we're talking about, we have to acknowledge that that's a huge challenge, particularly in countries facing a recession and so on, and that community resources, mainstream services are few and far between. Nevertheless, that kind of link to mainstream services is very important. I would say also that having provision for top-ups, of course I don't mean that women should be allowed to go back to prison to access something, but certainly in the community, if a woman has been able to utilise the services and support of a community centre for women, then even if the community order in England and Wales, the community order, when that comes to an end, the woman may have been meeting her probation officer within the community centre, having the possibility of going back just for additional support, I think is very important.
And it being okay to say that.
Yes,
and it,
absolutely. So I think a supportive milieu rather than a judgmental milieu is very important. Also, and again this relates to community centres in England and Wales in particular, and in Scotland and Northern Ireland for that matter. I think practical support for women, whether it's childcare or transport to actually get women to their centres, is very important. So, of course, that list doesn't reflect everything we know.
That's not far from exhausting.
About the relational dimension, the need for safe space, but those things are relevant too, as well as the gender responsive approaches, which themes which come through very strongly in the book.
Absolutely. I remember, this reminds me, I have to say, I really vividly remember when I came here for the MPhil. And I had done my undergraduate dissertation about women in crime in the UK and the States, and I really thought I'd done very well with it, so I thought I knew it all. I was very familiar with the Corsten report at the time, of which we're still working on the recommendations all those years down the line, unfortunately. And it was a very harrowing read, but I remember coming to you at some point and being like, but isn't it excellent? They're suggesting these hubs. And it was the first time, and I maybe I shouldn't admit this, but it was the first time I felt someone had really made me understand the importance of looking at things critically, even when they seemingly are great. Which is that you pointed out to me that, yes, that sounds well and good, but when these hubs then become fewer and further between, it's actually infinitely harder for women, who, especially ones on lower socioeconomic, with as single parents, to actually access any of those services. And it's silly, but it's really stuck with me ever since. I mean, they're talking 10, 11 years ago now, and it was just a small moment of like, of course, and we must think about it, just because we're saying that we can provide this service here. And I always really appreciated that. That little soundbite really stuck in my mind, and I really think it's helped push me to look at things in even more depth than I thought I was.
I hope I wasn't too critical. I mean, I think the Corsten report, Jim Corsten's report on vulnerable women in the criminal justice, was hugely important. It gave a further kickstart to developments in England and Wales in particular. I mean, I think that as it happens, the Labour government had started one or two initiatives, including Together Women, and initially 5 community centres for women hubs in 2 areas of the country, with positive results, although it wasn't always clear that sentences had grasped what the community centres were going to do. But even now, all these years later than Jean Corsten's report, published in 2007, although the number of community centres for women has mushroomed, it's also declined in recent years because some have closed because of lack of funding. Whether or not Jean Corsten's recommendation that all prisons be closed for women, whether that is realistic, I don't know, but it certainly challenges public thinking and academic thinking, and political thinking, to challenges us to think about the use of imprisonment and its overuse. I mean, Jean Corsten quite rightly recognised that all women in the criminal justice system are vulnerable. It's not just a small, specific group.
No, absolutely. And I think for me that was always what was quite so scary, is that we seem to capture such a vulnerable, multiply traumatized group that you think we should be recognising that more. And I think with the female population in particular, I know it's the same with the male population, but in particular the female population, that the mental health needs are much higher than in the general community. Again, that's something we should probably not be capturing in a prison and elsewhere. But that then leads into higher rates of suicide than we see out in the general community, where men are more likely to, we're still doing lower rates, but yes, I just thought that was always very harrowing. It's a very difficult read, but I think it's excellent that you're continuing to push these thoughts forward and continue to explore to try and improve these experiences. And there was one last one that I don't know, maybe this is something you'd seen, or I think it's what you're saying about mixed provision, that there was another Dr. Serena Wright, who worked with Ben Crew for a while, and she, in her PhD around women and experiences of crime, I think came up with the term frustrated desistance. And I've seen that perhaps that is a theme that also kind of comes through in the book, when you're asking for help, or you're being told you're being given help, or there is access, but the reality is actually somewhat different.
If I can make a political point.
Please do.
I think it's that in a context where agencies have to compete for funding, it very often means that there is a single topic or single theme approach. So it's mental health or housing,
Yeah.
for example, rather than thinking, actually, women, and for that matter men, have multiple problems, possibly including substance misuse as well. And none of the agencies on their own are equipped to deal with those multiple problems. And that is problematic. A fairly recent study, which I completed with Jane Dominy, colleague within the Institute, was interesting because it was a housing project. It was a project designed to look at women's housing needs upon leaving prison, and it was to try and stop the revolving door of women going back to prison. But actually, housing was the starting point. Accommodation was the starting point. Yeah. There are many other issues to do with mental health, substance misuse, and I would say having something to do as well. It's all very well setting people up, setting women up in accommodation, but what are they going to do all day?
Yeah.
You know, there needs to be a focus on things to do as well.
And what a waste of skills and people that are out there. It's just such a shame. But yeah, no, absolutely. The way these things, none of these things are separate in reality in a lifetime, are they? When people experience them. So, there is a question here about what we would say if you had. I wasn't sure if we wanted to wait till the end as a final thought about if you could make suggestions. If you had a minister right here, right now, what would I say? What might you say?
Oh gosh. Well, I can address it now. I mean, I think I would want to say something about the overuse of imprisonment that we, the UK as a whole uses imprisonment in excessive fashion compared with other countries in this part of the world. And we use imprisonment for non-violent offences. I would also want to say that it's important to look much more at public opinion.
Yeah.
And to sort of educate the public, but not to assume that the public are forever wanting tougher penalties. Of course, some of the red top newspapers convey that message, but serious academic research which has looked at public opinion suggests that given case studies, women and sentencing exercises, if people are asked, members of the public, about what would you do in this particular case, people are far more interested in rehabilitation, in reducing crime than is popularly supposed. And punishment, of course, doesn't necessarily reduce crime. It takes people out of harm's way for a while. And of course, I'm not so unrealistic as to think that we don't need prisons or other secure places which do put people out of harm's way. I think it's important to acknowledge.
But to the extent that we're using it.
Absolutely. If we were to take from prison many of those who commit non-violent offences, of course there are persistent offenders too, where I think we need to work much harder and think of what's going to work with this particular group of people. But we could use imprisonment much less. We could educate the public much more about what does work and what's likely to be effective. I would also want to say, and this wouldn't necessarily go down well just at the moment in terms of debates about resources and so on, but I would also want to say that investment now with people who have offended, whether it's to provide accommodation and other services, will produce longer term savings in terms of mental health,
it does.
health, childcare, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I'm doing this because yes, absolutely, and this is exactly what my PhD is on, which I'm finishing up at the moment, and it's very reassuring to hear other people saying it as well. I know other people are, but just hear it in person, and yes, I think you're absolutely right. The public opinion thing is such a challenging one because there seems to be this perception of they want to build prisons, or it's been it's very easy, I think, for the media to ask questions into certain groups so that they can convey that quite easily. We have a sample that say that they want prisons over something else, but in my studies, for example, which very much follows along from what you were saying of other high level public opinion pieces of research, that contrary to what people were expecting when I started, the focus was entirely both from general public members and a number of high level criminal justice practitioners, was that they wanted, whether it was to affect them personally or not, they wanted even their own money to go towards things that are more trauma-based as opposed to simply just acquisitive crime, and wanted that to be done in a rehabilitative or even preventative way, so we don't have to worry about it down the line. And
Absolutely.
but the money is the crux of the problem, unfortunately. So
the money and politics. I mean,
yes,
I'm struck by the importance of the female offender strategy, government strategy, produced in 2018, which quite rightly, in my view, focused on early intervention, stopping people getting to the criminal justice system in the first place. Secondly, focusing on effective community sanctions, including community centres and so on. And then, for perhaps those few women who do need to be in prison or some sort of secure accommodation, making that as effective and as gender responsive as possible. But, months after, literally months after that report was produced, well, actually a couple of years after, still months published to my mind, we have government pronouncing that there will be 500 extra places, prison places created for women, which just doesn't make sense. It kind of undermines the female offender strategy, which, for all its faults, and there are some limitations in that it doesn't recognise the needs of younger women or older women or minoritised women sufficiently well, in my view, and too little money was promised. But it just, the 500 extra places for women in prison just doesn't make sense. I mean, what on earth are we doing imprisoning women who are pregnant? It just doesn't make sense at all.
I know. Oh, yes. It's heartbreaking. I wonder if we move on a little bit, but I mean, obviously, still keep it on this topic of how much has this changed since you started looking into this? I don't know if that's possible. So would you say, so if we go back to the beginning of your journey, perhaps a little bit.
Yes.
I mean, were you always, did you always think this would be a main focus of yours, or is it you realised what was happening when you first started studying and thought, I can't let this go, and now here we are?
I mean, my initial focus, I came to the Institute to do the MPhil, 1980 or thereabouts, and my initial focus was very much on children and young people.
Right.
And that's partly because prior to coming to Cambridge, I worked as a social worker in childcare placements for a little while, and I was working with young people who'd got into trouble. So my focus, my MPhil thesis, was very much on children and young people. But it was during the MPhil year that I had the privilege of working with Alison Morris, who one of the lecturers she subsequently went to New Zealand to
Yeah.
be the director of the Institute of Criminology, Victoria University
Wow.
in Wellington. But she ran a course on women, crime and criminal justice, and it was absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So it was that hooked me.
Yeah.
And then, of course, my PhD was on women and criminal justice, and the rest is history. And although I've done other
Amazing.
things and
You have, yes.
other interests,
Yeah.
no, I think that women, crime and criminal justice has been at the core of my interests and my academic research.
And it really is the blessing of studying, isn't it? That you'll tap into one thing that you hadn't necessarily thought about, and all of a sudden here you are, and all the way those years down the line. So so from your MPhil here, you went to London, did your PhD? Is that correct? And then came back here.
No, I just did my PhD.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Did my PhD in the institute.
Yes. Okay.
As it happens, during the MPhil year, because I'd done the social work thing
Ah,
beforehand,
okay. Yeah.
I had a job lined up in the probation service to work in Bristol with the New Careers Movement, which was the kind of radical, innovative part of probation. It was all about employment opportunities. But I was persuaded to do a PhD instead, and I thought, well, I'll do this first, and then I'll, then I'll turn to probation. But that perhaps explains why much of my subsequent research has revolved around probation and community practice too. But my first job, postdoc, if you like, was at Lancaster University within the Centre for Youth Crime and Community. But it was working with the Metropolitan Police and local authorities in London. And it was all about diverting young people away from crime and indeed custody.
Right.
Crime courts and custody.
Yeah.
So it was a diversion project. And a second postdoc position took me to the University College of North Wales, although that was about a 2.5 year project working with colleagues from Bangor, but working mainly in the Midlands, actually in men's prisons, comparing and contrasting different prison regimes. I lived in Cambridge throughout this time. I might add. And then I was back to Lancaster to do research with colleagues there on the Crown Prosecution Service. So this was the time when the Crown Prosecution Service came into being in the 1980s, and I wanted to see what their operational philosophy was in regard to young people. And then London.
Sorry, I'm very sorry.
And then the London School of Economics for a couple of years, where I was a senior fellow looking at race and gender issues and pre-sentence reports prepared by probation officers, of course, or at least at the time prepared by probation officers. Then I came back to the Institute, although I'd maintained contact with the Institute ever since the PhD. So that my initial post was as Senior Research Associate, working on multi-agency aspects of crime prevention. It was a project that took me all over the country with colleague Mark Liddell, looking at how local authorities were approaching the issue of crime prevention. Then I was a departmental lecturer and was fortunate enough to have to get a university lectureship in 1994, and I've been at the Institute ever since. But never imagined, of course, that I would one day be director of the department where I have been a student.
I think it's wonderful. I loved that when you got the post. I thought it was extremely exciting. It was, I was very pleased for us as an institute. I think you're the first woman to hold the position, which is very notable in and of itself. I have to say, in my experience, so I've been involved with the institute since 2011, and so I've a few years. I've seen a few different directors, and I had really have to say, I think for a range of reasons, in my experience, you have had the hardest tenure that of the directors that I've seen, both with the Fishmongers Hall tragedy and then the impact of the COVID, the pandemic hitting, literally just a couple of months afterwards. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say. It must have been an extremely challenging time, something no one could have expected when you got the post.
No, or in my first week as director,
Yes.
there was a major flood in the basement.
As well, I did not know that one.
But Fishmongers Hall, of course, nobody could have prepared any head of department for such a thing, and it was a very difficult time for the whole of the institute, following the tragic incident at Fishmongers Hall, an event organised by colleagues leading the Learning Together initiative. This all happened on the 29th of November 2019, where one person previously convicted of terrorist offences who'd participated in a Learning Together programme in prison, bringing university students and prison residents together to learn together. This person, notwithstanding permissions to attend from the multi-agency public protection agency and probation officer, of course the person was on licence, having committed such serious offences, when he turned on other participants, and tragically 2 people died as a result. Others were injured, seriously injured. But Jack Merritt, working as a part of the Learning Together team in the Institute, and Saskia Jones, former MPhil student. Jack also had done the MPhil, but Saskia, former MPhil student and working on Learning Together as a volunteer, tragically lost their lives. A brilliant programme, Learning Together, tragic consequences. There have been many reviews, and the advisory group, the final advisory group, recommended to the university to close the programme, at least for the moment. I think I would want to say that there isn't a day that goes by without my thinking about the families and friends of Jack and Saskia and those in the Learning Together team who were at the event and who faced the immediacy of the tragedy. Of course, there are some lessons learned for everyone, and would that the intelligence that there was about this particular person, the perpetrator, would that the intelligence about the perpetrator have been passed on to the multi-agency public protection agency and the probation officers and indeed the organisers. I think that the pandemic, which followed hot on the heels of this huge tragedy, made grieving together as a community all the more difficult, because people were working at home. The institute, along with the rest of the university, closed March the 20th, 2020, and it did make it difficult. And of course, the grieving continues. I would say.
I agree, but with great validity that it does. So it's been. Have there been? So we know that there's been some extreme challenges in your time as director. Have there been high points as well in your 5 years? Is there a moment that you could think of that you felt especially glad that you had this position, perhaps? Or
it's certainly been a privilege, and there are highlights, many highlights to do with the research that people are doing,
Yeah.
and the people one meets, the international visitors that we have. I would simply say that the highlights are to do with working with such a brilliant group of students,
Mm-hmm.
brilliant group of academic staff,
Yeah.
and outstanding administrative and
Yeah.
other support in the institute. So all the challenges through the pandemic and after Fishmongers Hall, I think there is a sense of community, at least I hope there is a growing sense of community.
And it took everyone to work through all of this, and I think, yes, we was there, like you said, an excellent range of students and academic staff, absolutely, but also absolutely the administrative staff, who perhaps don't get quite as much notoriety, but definitely should do so. So alongside all of your accomplishments with the university from your academic position, you have also been a very strong leading light in Pembroke College as well. And is that's something that I hear has kind of, I think it brings you great joy alongside as there?
It does. It provides a different community,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoy the multidisciplinary aspect of that work. You know, you never quite know who you're going to be sitting next to at lunch, whether it's a zoologist or a chemist or whatever, but there is always a criminological theme, or there's potential for a criminological theme. I always remember meeting a college colleague in the waiting area in the Ministry of Justice, and we looked at each other and said, "What are you doing here?" And he was actually an engineer talking to chemists about bomb disposal and so on, and I was there to talk about something to do with community penalties and so on. So lots of links and lots of opportunity to learn from students, to be with students, and to learn from the students. And the college has also sponsored and hosted one or two initiatives, whether it's for the socio-legal group within the university, which I've been involved in book projects, so on and so forth. So, it's another source of inspiration and intellectual stimulation. So I'm very, again, privileged to be working and be alongside colleagues and students in Pembroke College.
Oh, that's just marvellous. I think it is, for me, it was when I found criminology, it just linked to everything. I think that you were just saying is there can always be a criminological aspect, even if it's not crime-based. It's, everything is governed by some sort of law, whether that be legal, moral, philosophical, and it's fascinating. I feel very privileged personally to be able to be involved in a subject and to have had my to be inspired by the institute, to know that whoever you meet, there's going to be some way that you can link these things together, and I think that's a wonderful side of it.
Sitting next to a zoologist, for example, one can learn about aggressive behaviour of birds in the botanic gardens. Well, are there parallels between human aggressive behaviour and bird aggressive behaviour?
How do we monitor the bird aggressive behaviour? Absolutely, I agree.
I'm conscious, I know you've got one or two other questions to ask, but I'm conscious that I didn't answer one of the questions you asked earlier about has the field changed
Yes,
much?
that would be,
And I think it has changed quite a bit since I first began to look at these things. It's much more sophisticated and much broader. But, when I started, it was at the time, in relation to women and criminal justice, it was the time when authors were thinking, we'd better have a chapter
to include some women
on women, and it was a sort of add women and stir kind of approach, and you'd find one chapter on women. I mean, the research on women has grown enormously since then, But there, of course, there are new
Lots in
topics.
part thanks to you, I have to say,
Well,
alongside many other illustrious names. But you really have been since the 80s a really strong voice in this side of criminology. And as a student who came after that, I really appreciated that and always have done. Because I think when you look back on it throughout history, and you start to realise that for an enormous chunk, for the majority of it, no one considered different pathways or different experiences, gendered experiences in any way so much.
And I learned from those
of course,
predecessors, whether it's Frances Hydenstone or Carol Smart or Alison Morris, and so on. But there are new topics too. I mean, the focus on victimisation is much wider than it was. There's new focus on human trafficking, on criminalisation of social behaviour, one might say. There's a current focus on pregnant women in prison. There's a new focus on cybercrime and new forms of social coercive behaviour, bullying, cybercrime bullying, and so on and so forth, all of which impact on women.
And as you were saying earlier, the increasing importance of recognising the intersectionality of experiences. And again, I'm very conscious as to white women, we're here, that understanding that different women are going to have a range of experiences also. We can't just say, this is, it's not yet another one size fits all, but how important it is to recognise that moving forward and continue exploring all these different experiences that are out there to improve it overall. I think it is wonderful. I do wonder, do you ever feel at some points less enthused with this as a subject as such? I don't know, I haven't phrased that very well, as in sometimes it can be a bit exhausting. It can feel that we're still saying the same things, but how important it is to continue saying those things, I suppose, is how do you manage that? If that's not too difficult a question.
It's a challenging question.
Sorry.
And one has to acknowledge, I would wish to acknowledge that some of the reversals in policy or the circuitous way in which policy develops and so on, it is frustrating. But I guess I think of it as a kind of jigsaw, and that each of us can only ever add pieces to the jigsaw and move them around and so on, but that every piece counts.
Yes.
And yes, we do have to keep saying the same things, and it's very frustrating, but it's also an incentive to think of new ways of saying what may have been said before. We have to keep saying things again and again and again, because the audience changes. And there is always potential for change. And if we look at things historically, there have been moments where there's been policy progression. Yes, some reversals, but sometimes things move forward, and those are the moments to hang on to. But we need to keep developing them.
Keep that to maintain the momentum, because we are in a different place to when you were here doing your MPhil.
Absolutely.
And those are the things to remember. I think sometimes when I feel a bit overwhelmed by it, that remembering exactly as you said. So I always imagine us as little cogs as opposed to a jigsaw, perhaps. But you're always building on. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the work that other people have done, whether we know their names or not, and to continue being a part of that. I think it's wonderful that we are continuing to push forward for a better world and a better way for these things to be managed, because it is possible. We just have to be loud about it. Are there any other comments or final thoughts you would like to add in? I don't know.
I am working on another book with a colleague at Glasgow, Michelle Berman.
Excellent.
And, we hope that's the excuse me. We hope that will see the light of day before too long. And that focuses very much on more recent developments in policy and practice in England and Wales. So it's women, crime and criminal justice.
Amazing.
Current research focuses on the arts and the criminal justice, the meaning and function of the arts, working with 1 or 2 colleagues in the Institute and with 8 partner organisations, arts-based organisations, looking at excuse me, what has impact, what's meaningful to women, whether it's drama or music or whatever. And we've got a 1-year follow-up, which I think is quite important, because although there's been a lot of research in that area, it's been quite short time.
Yeah.
A second current project is to do with vicarious trauma, again with colleagues in Scotland as well as a colleague in the Institute. And that's focusing on women working in the welfare sphere in the third sector in this particular piece of research, looking at women workers' experiences of vicarious trauma. For example, during the pandemic, women working in the welfare sphere in the third sector were sort of having front door conversations with women stuck at home because of the pandemic, in isolation and so on. And so we're interested in how those women have survived and the creative solutions that organisations have brought to organisational life and to the work with women. A third project, and this is something that I started with colleagues way back in 2012. That project or programme of research is to do with deaths under community supervision. There's been quite a lot of research on deaths in custody, prison custody, quite a lot of research on deaths in police detention, very little on deaths under community supervision. And given that we know that there's a peak rate of suicide within 24 hours of people leaving police detention, and within 8 days of people leaving prison, it's very important to look at the role of probation, to look at instances where people fall through the gaps, perhaps because who is responsible for that person. When I say responsible, I don't mean to cast judgment. No, the research approach is very much about appreciative inquiry, seeking to understand what good practice might look like and what the barriers are to achieving good practice. And more generally, I continue, the new book aside, I continue to have a focus on women and justice policy and practice, sort of commenting on policy developments and sentencing. And in the future, that's possibly an area that I will explore more, women's experiences of community sanctions, and thinking about vision possibilities, decision making in that area.
Oh, so keeping very busy as always, yes. But what a wonderful range of topics to be involved in, and I think it's they're all, they seem to be very practically based. Really looking into how can we improve these experiences and the criminal justice system, I suppose, moving forwards, because it is still something that I just think we're still so much further behind where we could be, and it's something that I find very interesting to talk to about those who are involved in the field and not. Because I think the expectations from those who are not necessarily involved in the field are that we are much further along than we are, because TV can give us an idea of reality that doesn't exist, but people assume, like I've already said, it's 2022, of course we have this already, and then having to always say, well, not yet, but we could. I I love that you're still very much exploring those ideas of how we can move forward from this. So thank you so very much for being here today and having the time for us to ask you these questions. It's very honoured to be asked to come and do this with you, and it's been fascinating, and can't wait to read the next book and the next book. And also just from, certainly from all the students that I've known, I know there's more out there, but I imagine they feel the same. Just thank you so much for your time as director. You've been extremely supportive and helpful and inspiring, and all the things that we could have wanted. And I've always, you're someone that even though you are director of the Institute, you were very personable and able to come to you. And I think as students of the Institute, that really means a lot. And so thank you for everything you've given us. And look forward to all your future stuff as well.
Thank you, that's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.